And I'm going to move us into the next part, which is before we get into our first breakout conversation, breakout room. And this part I call paradox, prediction, and perception. And this is so we've looked at the body and we've seen how things that show up in the body can impact our decision making and behavior, but it's not the only thing that happens. The brain is constantly processing paradox. And so when I talk about paradox, the simpler for me, the better. And so I use this definition from Merriam-Webster Dictionary. And a paradox is simply something that is seemingly contradictory or opposed to common sense. Now, I'm not going to ask for examples, but I'm sure you could call to mind lots of things happening today in our families, in our communities, and in our country that don't seem to quite make much sense. And if you think about that, the brain is constantly trying to do sense making and making sense of paradox. Now, when the brain is doing that, it is also leveraging its natural predictive nature. And what we know is that the brain is a predicting organ. And some of you may be familiar with the work of Regina Pali and her really robust article on the predicting brain. And she so nicely explains this for us so we can grasp this concept. And that is that the brain non consciously predicts what is most likely to happen and sets in motion perceptions, emotions, behaviors, and even interpersonal responses that it believes is best adapted to what is expected. Now, all of that happens behind the scenes before anything even happens. And then the brain uses past learning as the guide for what to expect in the future. And then we live the future we expect. And because of prediction, our present experience and responses are shaped by the past. So, what I often say to people is when you have a situation where somebody, you think of somebody a certain way, whether you think they're the best thing since sliced bread or you think that they are just awful, you'll be right because your brain's going to be looking for evidence to prove that you are right. Now, here's what happens though. So the brain is predicting every few moments the future. So imagine that how important that is for us because if the brain had to react its way through the brain through the day, we would be in a lot of trouble. If the brain we waited and then the brain waited for things to happen and then tried to take action. The brain does this out of self-preservation, out of efficiency, all kinds of things. And it predicts to provide also not just efficiency, but speed. And it continuously operates in this prediction, perception, action cycle. Now, the challenge is that predictions can alter perception, and perception and prediction are based on the narrow data set of what we call our life experience. So, if we have not had an experience, the brain is going to do its best to guesstimate what the outcome might be, but it is heavily informed and influenced by what's happened to us up until that point in our lives. So that means things like trauma, our celebrations, our challenges. The special, unique thing and reason why I bring out the trauma piece is because when we think about showing up in our way of being, in our contemplative practices, and the infusion of equity and an expanded worldview, um, the trauma plays a significant role. And trauma is relative, right? So we all have our own traumatic experiences. So there's the individual, there's collective, and then there's also intergenerational. And all of that sits within us and between us, amongst us, in the ecosystems in which we live. So I'm going to give you an example of this prediction perception relationship. So this is the Kinesia triangle. If I were to ask you how many large triangles do you see on the screen? Just show of hands, how many would you say? Two, 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 zero, two. All right. And for those of you who didn't answer, I know because you think it's a trick question. And guess what? Three. Take David. It is a trick question because it is an illusion. And Sean, you win the prize. There actually are no triangles on the screen. Instead, what we see is this specific arrangement of these little graphics. Now, for those of you who are my age or older, you may recognize the one on the left as the Pac-Man kind of thing that eats the little pieces in the video game. And the others are just like little little divots. Now, what happens is that the brain, when it's assembled in a particular pattern, the brain works and pulls in its inner data set and says, wait, there's something missing. What fills in this space? And hey, I've had geometry, I've had algebra. They must be triangles. So the brain fills in this perception that there is a triangle. Now, this kinesia effect or kinesia triangle was first sort of discovered in the mid 1950s by an Italian psychologist named Gaetano Kinesia, which is where we get the name the kinesia effect. Now, here's what it also does: it doesn't just predict what might be there. Oftentimes, when I ask people, what about that white triangle out front that really isn't there? What do you notice about that? And people say, well, it's definitely brighter and more prominent, kind of lifted off the page. And it does appear that way, but that also is not true. It's the same level of intensity as the background white, and it is not lifted or raised up off the other graphics in any kind of way. So it's a really good example of how we begin to see the relationship between prediction and perception. And when we pull that all together with the research that tells us that stuff happens in the body and influences our decision making and behavior before we're even aware, we can see how all of that is ripe for the context and the moments where unconscious bias and behaviors like microaggressive behaviors can show up.